Hello, everyone. My name is Stephen Meunier, and I am the director for online instruction here at My Guru LLC. I have a lot of experience working specifically with GRE and GMAT students, such as yourself. And today we're going to talk about the differences between the GRE and the GMAT, so you can make the best decision to as to which exam you want to choose for your admissions needs. So let's go ahead and share my screen. And so we're going to talk about which is the better MBA entrance exam. And as I mentioned, my resume, I am the director of online instruction at My Guru. I've got over 15 years of test prep instruction experience. So I have seen changes that have happened over these exams over the last decade and a half. And I've seen how admissions officers here in the United States and abroad have been adjusting their their focus around these two exams. As the GRE has eaten into the GMAT market share to some degree. I'm also a published test prep textbook writer. I have written for some various outfits previously, including I am a writer for the questions on GRE Prep Club, the practice exams themselves, and there's the tidbit about that. So let's dive right into the GRE exam overview. So the GRE exam is always going to start with section one, which is the analytical writing. You've got two essays, 30 minutes each, and it's going to be 60 minutes in total. Now, these two essays, one of them is going to be an issue essay, one of them is going to be an argument essay. In the issue, you have to present your position on an issue. On the argument essay, you have to present your evaluation of a provided argument. You can use fewer than the 30 minutes on either essay, but you cannot allocate that extra time to the other essay. And then sections 2 through 5 are going to be quantitative or verbal in alternating order, uh, depending on whether it's uh, scored or unscored. And it does not have to go in any specific order. It can be quantitative, verbal, quantitative, verbal, quantitative. It can be quantitative, quantitative, verbal, 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 and almost always you're going to have one unscored section within what actually ends up being sections 2 through 6, because only 4 of the 5 sections you'll see are scored. One of them will be an experimental. In the quantitative, you're going to have 20 questions and 35 minutes each. In the verbal, you're going to have 20 questions and 30 minutes each. So you can see you have about a minute 45 per question on the quantitative side of the exam. You have about a minute and a half for the verbal. So it is a faster exam than the GMAT. And these sections themselves are adapted. So what that means is within a given section of the GRE, you can actually skip over a question, come back to it, which is different than the GMAT as well. And as I mentioned, those sections can come in any order, so you don't necessarily know whether it's going to be quantitative first, verbal first, or they're going to be back to back verbal, back to back quantitative on the just the algorithm of the exam. Then the GMAT is going to have an analytical writing assessment, but only one essay, and it's only going to be 30 minutes. So the GMAT has a significantly less strenuous essay requirement, just the one essay as opposed to two. And that's because they instead use the integrated reasoning. And the integrated reasoning is going to be 12 questions in 30 minutes. And that's going to be about two and a half each. And these are all going to be your interactive questions where there are tables you can sort, tabs you can select, that sort of thing. Then you get into the meat of the GMAT. Quantitative reasoning, 31 questions, 62 minutes, so an average of 2 minutes per, as opposed to a minute 45 per quantitative question on the GRE. Then you have the verbal reasoning, which is going to be 36 questions and 65 minutes, about a minute 50 or so per question average on the verbal of the GMAT. So again, about 20 seconds more per question on the GMAT than the GRE. And of course, you've got longer sections there. And of course, the GMAT also is adaptive by question. So that means that every question, depending on whether you get it right or wrong, impacts your subsequent question. And you cannot skip and go back to problems on the GMAT as you can on the GRE. Then with the GMAT, you actually get section ordering options. So you're going to have 3 different available orderings, and you get to pick and set it so you don't have to worry about that variability that you do have on the GRE. So, you get to choose quant, then verbal, then integrated reasoning, and the analytical writing assessment, or verbal, then quant, then the integrated reasoning and the analytical writing assessment. Or you can start with the analytical writing assessment, the integrated reasoning, and then go quant to verbal. It's really up to you what your preference is. There is no real difference in the ordering except for personal preference. So then our scoring overview. So the GRE, there is no combined score reported ever. That you may hear things like I'm looking for a 300 or a 320. It isn't how the GRE reports, though. They always report the individual quantitative and verbal scores only on a scale of 130 to 170. So it's up to the individual institution to decide if they want to combine them for their own evaluation. You can see here that a 50th percentile on the quantitative side of the exam is going to be a 154, and the 50th percentile for the verbal is going to be a 151. So similar to the GMAT, you have a higher average score on the quantitative side than the verbal. Just usual kind of breakdown there. And then the analytical writing is reported individually as well on a scale of 0 to 6 in half point increments. The analytical writing 50th percentile on the GRE is going to be a 4, and the 4 is probably all you'll need for the GRE essay score at any point. And honestly, for most MBAs, a 3.5 will almost always be sufficient, and that's around the 40th percentile, just because the GRE essay scoring is so much more difficult than the GMAT. The GMAT has only the one essay, only evaluate an argument. They really diminish the importance of the essay. Whereas on the GRE, the essay is actually the hardest thing to get a perfect score on. Getting a 6 on the GRE is more difficult than anything else that you'll encounter on this exam. So then the GMAT scoring, you've got, of course, that combined quant and verbal scale of 200 to 800. They actually take the quant and the verbal scores, combine them into that magical score that many people will say, I want a 600 or a 700 or 750, something of that nature. The combined score, 50th percentile for the GMAT, is going to be about a 590. And the individual quantitative and verbal scores that go into that 800 are reported on a scale of 0 to 60. And you can again see that the quantitative 50th percentile on the GMAT is even more starkly higher than the verbal percentile, 50th percentile. So just generally, you could see that the verbal is probably more difficult from this scoring scale on the GRE than the GMAT, but you can see that the average scorer does much better on the quant. And then the analytical writing, as I mentioned, that's also on a scale of 0 to 6, but the 50th percentile on the GMAT is a 5. So almost 50% of people who take the GMAT, it's technically a 54 or 54th percentile, 53rd percentile, that you get a 5 score, but almost half of all GMAT test takers get a 5 or higher on their essay. And the 6 is the 88th percentile as opposed to the 99th percentile for a 6 on the GRE essay. So again, the essay scoring is probably the biggest difference in terms of difficulty between the two exams. So let's talk about the GMAT scores with the GR versus GRE scores. Generally, the quantitative scores are emphasized for both exams from a business school perspective. It's just the nature of business degrees. They tend to prioritize quantitative skills over verbal skills. So because of that, they're going to care least about the essay, right? The verbal score itself, they're less interested in, and you're going to have to submit your own essay anyway. That's going to be separate from the standardized testing in order to gain admission, be it a personal statement, case studies, those sorts of things. Then the integrated reasoning score, because that isn't part of the GRE, you basically just want to make sure that that correlates closely to what your overall GMAT percentile was. So if you're looking at, say, a 600, 650, you want to be in a 6 to 7 range for the integrated reasoning. If you're looking at a 700 or above, you should be at a 7 or above for the integrated reasoning. That integrated reasoning section scored on a scale of 0 to 8, or excuse me, 1 to 8, and it's basically a breakdown where 82nd percentile is going to be a 7, and a 92nd percentile is going to be an 8, and that's the highest score that you can get. Most institutions care least, or care not least, care least about the essay, but they care little about the integrated reasoning score. However, there have been instances where I've worked with students recently in the past couple of years where they have had to retake the GMAT for the integrated reasoning score only. In particular, this has happened with European business schools. They have begun prioritizing the integrated reasoning more for whatever reason in the last couple of years. And so basically, there's a correlation that schools use to get a GMAT score from the GRE, and the GRE itself at ets.org/GRE/institutions/about/MBA/comparison underscore tool. You could start plugging in GRE scores and see what that would correlate to the GMAT according to the makers of the GRE. And that's probably the resource that admissions officers are using if you were to submit a GRE to convert into a GMAT. So you could use that, play along, and see what your scores on the GRE might convert into, and see if they're comparable for whatever programs that you're looking at. Most programs will publicize GMAT scores. Not every program will publicize GRE scores, so you may want to play with that tool a little bit on your own. And you can see that a 700 plus GMAT score, because the GMAT is combined, will require roughly a 164 or higher on the quantitative side and above a 163 on the verbal to pop out that 700 that a lot of folks, I'm sure, are aiming for. So let's talk about the pros and cons of the GRE. So the pro of the GRE, shorter sections, but the con, it's a longer exam. You've got that extra fifth experimental section. You've got 2 essays as opposed to 1. So that's just going to be the breakdown for timing. Now, another pro for the GRE, you actually get a calculator. It's not a great calculator, but there is a calculator within the interface of the exam that you can open up during the course of taking the quantitative sections and use to do calculations. Whereas in the GMAT, obviously, there is no calculator for the quantitative section, although there is a calculator for the integrated reasoning section. And the con, however, is that in the GRE, they test vocabulary. In the GMAT, they do not. So approximately 50% of the verbal on the GRE is going to involve questions that are centered around vocabulary. So that oftentimes is a difficult thing to learn in a short period of time. Another pro, you generally have an easier quantitative section, but the con is that there are more quantitative concepts tested on the GRE. You'll find sometimes in the very high end of the GRE more abstract arithmetic, algebraic, and even like coordinate geometry kind of concepts, parabolic functions, that sort of thing. Graphing circles on the coordinate plane, which doesn't usually show up in the GMAT. Those sorts of concepts can show up on the GRE more frequently than the GMAT, but it'll only be if you get into the harder second section generally. And of course, on the GRE, you can skip and return to questions, but in turn, you have less time per question. So you're going to have the ability on the GRE to look at a problem and say, I don't want to do that right now because it's going to take me a lot of time. Let me go get the rest of the questions in the section before I spend time there. Obviously, you can't do that on the GMAT, but the con is that you're looking at 15 to 20 seconds fewer per question on the GRE versus the GMAT just because of the timeout. Then for the GMAT, some pros and cons. So, of course, it's the shorter exam, but it has longer sections. So the GMAT is basically set into thirds. There's a 60-minute third that includes the analytical writing and the integrated reasoning. Then you have a 10-minute break. Then there's a approximately 60-minute third for the verbal section, 65 minutes. Then you have a 10-minute break. Then you have approximately a 60-minute third of the 62-minute quantitative section. So it's a shorter exam, only a little over 3 hours, whereas the GRE almost approaches 4, but you end up with longer sections. Now, of course, you have no vocabulary on the GMAT, though. So you don't have to worry about studying vocabulary kind of just consistently and without really an end because the English language is so prolix. You just have a huge amount of vocabulary words in the English language. So on the GMAT, you don't have to spend time studying them. But of course, there's no calculator on the quantitative section. You also generally have a easier verbal section. You've got shorter reading comprehension passages frequently on the GMAT, but the con to the GMAT is you do have grammar tested. Now, grammar is not tested on the GRE, whereas vocabulary is. So again, just some differences stylistically between the exams that you may want to consider as you decide which one to take. And again, you do have more time per question on the GMAT, about 2 minutes per quant, and then about a minute 50 per verbal. But of course, you can't skip questions because of the adaptive nature of the exam. So then it comes down to the question, which exam is right for me, right? So first, consider your own personal proficiencies. That's the most important thing. Look at those pros and cons. This presentation will be available once the video has been finalized, so you can review back through this, consider those pros and cons, consider the different facets of the two exams, because that's the most important thing. Which one will get you a higher score? And usually using that conversion tool that we saw earlier. If you're better at verbal, generally you'll want to lean towards the GRE because that's going to be the harder portion of that exam, more reading, more vocabulary. If you're better at quantitative, though, start with the GMAT because the MBA admissions folks are generally going to prefer the GMAT, and there's going to be more information for you to compare against GMAT test takers and GMAT applicants than for the GRE. So stick to the GMAT unless you see a distinct performance gap on your own results as you're doing practices, because that's probably going to be the more germane exam for most business school applicants. And of course, take a free diagnostic at mba.com and ets.org/GRE to determine your score baselines for both exams to make an educated decision. So, of course, engage the experts and your fellow applicants in the forums at greprepclub.com. You can also go to GMAT Club, ask questions. Folks like myself, other folks who are experts, directors in the forum will be happy to answer your questions as they come along. We at My Guru also through GRE Prep Club, we offer a free GRE tutoring demo, and you can see the link for that there if you want to just talk with an expert such as myself about the GRE versus the GMAT and how to best align your test taking experience to your application goals. And of course, you can always email me directly at smainier at myguruedge.com. So that is pretty much the run through um, our show here, and I'd like to open it up now to questions. And so, okay, so that's from. So to study a business analytics course, which exam is recommended? So it really depends on the program, right? And there are, especially if you go outside of discussing the MBA specifically, the GRE is going to be accepted probably more openly for all exams, just because, for instance, the like if you want to get an accounting exam, the GRE is probably going to be more openly accepted than the GMAT for that sort of degree. But it really is going to be dependent on the program, and they should tell you exactly what they require. And again, you just kind of have to reach out to the school, reach out to the admissions folks, because it does get dictated to a degree by just what the individual program requires without knowing specifically where you're applying, what country you're applying to, what program it is. If it's and again, if it's just an individual course, it's kind of hard to predict what necessarily would be better. It really is up to the admissions folks. Oh, oh, okay. So experience in pre-sales and business development currently at a big four, thinking of taking up specialized business STEM MBA. So in this case, if you're looking at MBA in business analytics, I'd probably say stick to the GMAT. Anything that is directly tied to masters in business, if business is in the title specifically and it's a true masters, the GMAT is going to be their preference um, almost every time. But there are going to be some instances where, again, if they accept the GRE, always confirm that the programs accept the GRE before attempting to submit a GRE. But if they accept the GRE and your level of proficiency is, has a big gap in it, then you might consider submitting the GRE. But for these types of programs, I would recommend starting with the GMAT for certain. Absolutely. So that was in the presentation. You can reach out to either info at myguruedge.com, or you could reach out to me directly. My email was in the presentation. It is SMAISNIER at myguruedge.com. What other questions? Total work experience of around 4 years, playing my master's in 2021. Want to be an expert in product management. My target full time. So, project management courses, they may or may not require the MBA, a GMAT. The full time MBA almost exclusively, almost without exception, will require a GMAT. So, product management is going to be a slightly different program, and those can have different requirements outside of even the GRE or the GMAT, depending on the individual program needs and what they require for admission. As for the weight of planning for a master's, sometime in 2021 or even further out, one thing to note is that the GRE and GMAT are each acceptable to submit for 5 years. So if you were to take a GMAT, say in February of 2020, this month, at the end of this month, that would be a score that you could use until February of 2025. So just another thing. Any other questions that I can potentially answer? Well, it's been a great little short summary of the GMAT versus the GRE here this morning in the States and this evening out in most of Asia. So thanks for joining this today. And obviously, if you have any more questions, feel free to look at the presentation once it's posted and send any emails to either info at myguruedge.com or myself at myguruedge.com as well. Thank you for the time and have a great day.